So last week we talked about ABM marketing in general and implementing an ABM strategy and why that's a really great kind of step forward for a lot of marketing people or marketing personas. So now I wanted to dive more specifically into LinkedIn ads and how you can use an ABM strategy with LinkedIn ads. So just to start, would love to get into the targeting options for people trying to use an ABM list with their LinkedIn ad strategy.
Yes. So this is a pretty common topic, especially ABM is kind of, I feel like, trending again. It goes in waves and people are looking more and more at LinkedIn ads. And so combining the two seems to be a natural progression. But when it comes to targeting with LinkedIn ads, I guess there's a couple of ways that people usually do it. And then there's a way that I would suggest doing it. So the first way is most people, it seems like when they're doing an ABM approach, they're grabbing contact lists because that's what they're used to doing. Almost all ABM motions, if you're going to do ABM through email or Facebook or programmatic or anything else, it seems like you have to have the actual people's data. So a lot of times when companies try to come to us to do an ABM, they have contact lists and they can upload those contact lists and they could target, LinkedIn will try to match those people based on email and job titles and stuff like that. And then you can run ads on that. The second way to do targeting with ABM is uploading company lists. So I would actually say that a company list is preferred to a contact list for two reasons. The first is that a prospect list or a person list, it degrades like 20 to 30% every year because people move jobs. So if you're targeting those people who specifically work at these companies, they're going to change companies and you're going to lose that targeting every year. But if you upload a company list, you can layer on LinkedIn filters. So you can say, okay, they're one of these 100 companies that I want to work with, and it's these position titles or these seniorities of these job functions within the company. And so if you do that, the list actually becomes dynamic. So as people come or leave that company and come into those positions that you're marketing to at those companies, the list stays up to date even as people change jobs. So I would say that would be my number one recommended way to use ABM targeting is to have a company list and then to layer on personal demographic and say, okay, they're either these position titles or these seniorities in these job functions and make sure they're in, residents of these countries, and you could layer on some additional interests. So those would be the two main ways. And then the third way of looking at ABM targeting that probably most people don't really think of is that I would actually look at LinkedIn's native filters. So the whole reason people are building ABM lists up front is because they want to target high value accounts. So they need to do some research and they find out the names of these companies. But if you're targeting, size 50 to 200 companies in the software industry that are based in the United States, you could actually build all those same filters with LinkedIn native filters. They're just kind of unnamed accounts. So they meet your target criteria, but they're just not named. You don't know the actual names of those people. You just know the criteria fits what you want. And that's, I guess, a lot of people wouldn't consider that maybe ABM because they really think having the list of accounts is what makes it ABM. But I would say it's still ABM in spirit. They're just unknown or unnamed accounts that you're targeting. So those would be the three main options that I would look at.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You kind of hinted at this last week too about using LinkedIn's native targeting to build almost like a pseudo ABM list. So I'm kind of curious too, just to piggyback off of that, like what really would, or how would you consider kind of LinkedIn native targeting as similar to an ABM strategy where it might be different from other like Facebook native or something like that?
Yeah, and I think that's why people do get scared is because compared to Facebook, okay, there is just not even an option to use native filters to find your ABM list because all you could basically do is say they like or follow these certain pages or they have these topical interests. There's no company data. You can't base them based on company size or industry. And even job titles on Facebook are not, they're not in any kind of way coherent or cohesive like on LinkedIn. So the fact that you can actually target people by position title, by company size, by industry, by job function, like, yeah, that just doesn't exist on the other platforms. So LinkedIn would definitely give you an added benefit of having that as an option.
Yeah, I think that's like the big key with LinkedIn, or I feel like the reason why we in particular lean into LinkedIn for B2B marketing specifically, because it's just so advanced in its ability to target, and the information that Facebook, or I guess Meta now, or any other like social media platform is going to have on job data or companies that you're part of is not going to be nearly as accurate as what people are going to have on LinkedIn for sure.
Yeah, and Meta, I guess the other big thing with that one is, I mean, yeah, I think we get into retargeting later, but the whole idea of like, yeah, you can't qualify them before unless you come with a list. And then on Meta, you have to come with a prospect list, because you can't bring a company list and then have any, okay, they're at one of these companies and they follow Gary V and we're going to target them that way. Like, okay, that's not going to work out the same. So yeah, I think that's the big difference. But LinkedIn, like no other platform has these filters, and most companies aren't as familiar with LinkedIn. So they just don't realize that you can you could essentially create ABM lists with LinkedIn native filters. The one other thing I would say is, in order to test this theory, so if you're already running, I guess we'll get to this in best practices. Watch a little later and we'll get into a nice tip that I think will be really, really powerful for those that want to run ABM with LinkedIn.
Yeah, definitely. Well, getting back into what we were talking about before, you mentioned like setting up a retargeting framework for an ABM list on LinkedIn. Yeah. How would you go about, retargeting, or how would your setup look different there?
So depending on how big the ABM lists are, because a lot of companies, if they've been doing this for a while, they have like the TAM, the total addressable market, and they'll have like, okay, here's the all of our ideal clients. Like, here's the whole list. And then they'll have a bunch of sub lists. So the one thing I would say is, okay, if most of your pockets or ABM list uploads are like 300 people, 500 people, sure, it might be impossible to ever consider retargeting with ABM. But if you have like a big total addressable, okay, here's our dream client list, and expand it a little bit to not just the relevant, like just the end decision maker, but also the other people in the room. And if that expansion and that group of people is like 20, 30, 40, 50,000, which it might be, then you could do something where you say, okay, if they exist in this list and they have visited my website or my company page or interacted with any of my cold ads, then, or watched any of my videos from the cold layer, and they're part of this top 500 companies I want to work with, then I want to pull them into retargeting. You can actually do that with LinkedIn. You can say they're part of this list of companies and they have some warm touch. That means they've interacted with our brand in some way. And so almost no company that I've seen who has an ABM approach of marketing that leverages LinkedIn ads, they pretty much just ignore retargeting completely on LinkedIn. They're just loading ABM lists, they're just loading cold campaigns, and they don't touch retargeting. So I would say, yeah, the two things you could definitely do is your big group of companies you want to work with, and if those exist in your warm audiences, you should be targeting them. And then the second thing I would do is you should use LinkedIn's native criteria and just say, okay, I'm targeting people of this company size, of these industries, and these position titles within those companies. If those people already exist and they've been to my website or my company page, like if they meet those criteria that I'm targeting with my ABM and they're in my warm audience, sure, I don't know that they're on one of these top 500 companies I want to work with, but there must be in a similar situation. I do want to retarget those. You're doing all these ABM efforts through LinkedIn or these different channels. If those people who have the high quality criteria exist in your warm audiences already, yes, of course, it would be really beneficial to get back in front of them and retarget. So that's the main thing. And it sounds simple. See if your people on your list are actually in your warm audience, or see if people who look very similar to your list are already in your warm audience. But I can't tell you, I could count on one hand the amount of mature companies that I've audited that are actually doing that to get the most out of their spend.
So it sounds like maybe the common mistake that we see here is that people have an ABM list and think that, they can kind of do cold ABM and then expect conversions, right? But they're missing that middle retargeting section. So what
Yeah.
would you, I guess, kind of include in that retargeting section that might be different from what's in the cold ABM list?
Yeah, and usually it's a little messaging. So in the cold lists, a lot of times it's the kind of ads where it is usually promotional. It's first touch, and so it's, hey, this is who we are and what we do, or hey, this is the main pain point we solve, or hey, this is the results that we get for clients. So a lot of times in those ABMs, they're doing things that would make sense for these brand awareness, first touch kind of things. And so what I would suggest is, okay, if you were successful and you got 300, 400, 500, 1,000 people who saw your message and interacted with it and visited your website, you now need to say something slightly different in retargeting. And this kind of goes with like our normal impactable retargeting is like, okay, it's not just enough to stay top of mind. There's something, especially in ABM, the assumption is that these are higher tiered accounts with either enterprise or a lot more value. So it also makes sense that it's going to take more trust to win them. It's going to take a longer sales cycle to convert them. So the big thing I would focus on, just like we advise most of our clients, is get back in front of them and build trust and credibility. Show case study examples, show brands you've worked with, show client results, show thought leadership. Actually highlight the subject matter experts in your organization and position yourself as the trusted kind of expert in your space, because that's ultimately what's going to move the needle with these big accounts. They need to trust you more. And that's the kind of like retargeting campaign I would focus on. And the other thing I would do with that group, knowing that it is a longer sales cycle, I would look for more than, the shorter term sales cycle. I would look for ways to use that like 90-day retargeting window where you're spending most of your money. I would look for ways to funnel them into my organic channels, either my newsletter, my YouTube channel, my LinkedIn company page, my LinkedIn personal, whatever channels you have that are organic. Try to use that time and money to funnel people into those pockets. That way, if it is a really long sales cycle, like 18 or 24 months, chances are they're going to drop out of your paid channels, but you could continue to nurture them and build trust organically through one of those communities. So I'd say the longer the sales cycle, the higher value target, the more I would push into communities as well during that time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, I think, that you're touching on there, that pipeline from ABM list with ads back to organic. I feel like a lot of times people almost think about it in the opposite way, where like, oh, they'll see us organically first and then we'll target them with ads. So it's kind of interesting to see that, synergy between the two channels where they can kind of link back and forth to each other there.
Yeah, it's a little different than I think most people do. And you're right, because most people, I don't think most organizations have an organic and a paid that work well together at all. They do organic stuff. And then, they think that anything organic they do is like top of funnel touch. Okay, we'll do SEO, we'll do organic. Maybe we'll make some noise and someone will check out our website. Then we'll hit them with our paid ads. I do kind of think of it a little differently because, again, the big determining factor for me is it takes a lot of money to stay in front of someone for 90 days or 180 days. And these sales cycles for some of these B2B orgs are like 18 months or 24 months. So there's no possible way you have the budget to stay in front of them that long in a paid sense. So maybe you get on the radar organically, you retarget them with paid, but then somewhere along the line, I had the idea and it kind of made a lot of sense where, okay, if I can get them to actually like entrench themselves in one of my organic channels after my paid drops off, like I have a chance to still stay with them long term. So I really like that. And I do think the longer the sales cycle and the higher value the target, the more that play makes sense because that long-term nurture could really come in handy.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting, I think, to me to see the relationship between organic and paid, because a lot of times people think about them as one and the same, other than like paid is organic with money behind it. But in all reality, organic kind of supports more of this long-term nurture that I think should be approached differently than you might do with your paid ads. And by understanding that difference or distinguishing between those two channels, you can really find some better ways for them to connect with each other, and work cohesively rather than almost like working against each other in a way.
And this could be a good clip for a shout out to our content offer. But to be honest, most organic content from companies is garbage. It is top of the funnel because it's top of the funnel, fluffy content that would never move the needle on trust and credibility. So that's also why they think of it that way. We're putting these fluffy blogs out and these fluffy corporate posts that are only good for one thing, to get our brand in front of someone for the first time. But if they already know who we are, it's never going to move the needle on trust, credibility. It's not going to position us as experts. So I would say if that's why you're thinking this way and your organic would never help move the needle middle of the funnel, you need to rethink your organic strategy. You need to inject more thought leadership, subject matter expertise, more interviews, podcasts, things like that, so that your organic communities and content can actually move the needle on trust. And then you can amplify that with paid. But yeah, that's a big problem with a lot of people as well.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I know we've talked about that a lot in the past too. So just getting back on track here with talking about ABM for LinkedIn ads in particular, interested in some common mistakes that you kind of see when implementing an ABM strategy. I know you mentioned a few in there that people have made, but I know that you've worked with a lot of kind of ABM strategies here. So what are some mistakes that you've seen?
Probably number one mistake is not retargeting at all, thinking that ABM is just this cold approach to get on a first touch with these high value targets, which to me, it just boggles my mind, because the fact that it is a high value target, how do you get away from those two things? It's going to take longer to convert them, and it's going to take more trust to convert them. And yet you just load these cold campaigns, you run them for like 90 days and then you move on to your next list. So I would say not taking a proper long-term nurturing, trust building approach that includes retargeting, huge mistake. Mistake number two is, I think, loading these micro small lists and then over budgeting how much you put in there. That's a pretty big mistake, because you have a list of like 1,000 prospects and then you throw $200 a day at it. And almost always, like 99% of the time, when I see companies do this, I see the same thing. It's big pop-up results in the first 30 days and then huge diminishing returns, hemorrhaging cash, and it's not going to be ROI. And they don't notice it until like month 3, because they had such good results in month 1 that month 2 gets a pass. And then it's month 3 or 4 before anyone's like really scratching their head like, this thing doesn't seem as great as I thought it was. So I would say use a budget that's appropriate or proportionate to the list. So if you have a tiny list, it should be a tiny budget. Like, don't be afraid to just put $10 or $15 a day to a ABM uploaded list that has, 500, 1,000 people. Like, it doesn't need $100 a day. In fact, it would be better to what I call slow burning it. If you put $10, $15 a day on a tiny list, you could work that list for 3, 4, 5, 6 months profitably, because you'll be slowly converting people, but you're not burning a ton of cash. And then as people are active on LinkedIn and logging on, they'll start to see, so you won't experience this huge diminishing return. So you'll be okay to leave it on longer. And then I would, so proportionate budget. And then the fourth one, in my mind, is not using LinkedIn's native filters, because they think that ABM means that it's only uploaded lists. I would definitely argue that if you put the budget proportionate to the list you upload, you'll then need some additional budget and runway. So you'll want to create some campaigns with native LinkedIn filtering. Those will probably take a little more budget because they'll be larger and you'll want to give them more runway. So that would be my main top 4 probably mistakes that companies make.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a few of those too in some of my clients that want to implement an ABM list. I actually had a client talk to me today about wanting to bring in an ABM list, and I was asking them about the size, and it seemed very small, and they were really adamant about putting a lot of budget into it. So I think this might be a good tidbit of information to share with them too.
Yeah, that's probably good.
Yeah. And then last question here, just wanted to end the conversation with some best practices for businesses looking to maximize their ABM results with LinkedIn ads.
In that case, especially like where you have a client who's loading small ABM lists. So a couple of the best practices I would say is target more than just the end decision maker. So if the list is relatively small, a lot of times they're laser targeted and they're like, okay, here's the 2 decision makers at each of the 100 companies I want to work with. So I have a list of 200 people. or you barely have enough to like retarget. You have 500. What I would say is an ABM approach at these high value target accounts. One of the things that I think you should do is expand to other people in the room, anyone who's involved in that decision-making process. The ABM folks at Full Funnel would call them the buying committee. I would expand my target to them because I have the idea of like deal acceleration. If one person in the company, maybe it is a decision maker, if someone brings up the topic of, hey, we need to run LinkedIn ads, and I've heard, I'm getting targeted with Impactables ads. Has anyone else heard about them? I'm considering giving them a talk. If anyone else in that room has heard or been exposed to the ads and heard of, the solution, and there's someone else who could chime up and say, hey, yeah, I've heard of them. They seem legit. Maybe we should give them a try. That helps accelerate that deal so much faster. If other people in the organization, other people involved in the decision. So what I would do is, instead of, just the end decision maker, look at who else is part of that buying committee, part of the discussion, and expand your audience to them. Because ideally, like if you have a small company of 50 people that you're looking to do business with, like why target the 2 decision makers? Like if half of the company, if you can get on the radar of half of that company, 25 people, anyone from senior level up, and they all know who you are, that's your best chance of doing business with them. If like the whole company knows who you are, you're really going after them. To me, that's like the true ABM approach, is really entrenching yourself with that. So that would be tip number 1. The other best practice is if you upload an ABM list and then you go into targeting, and maybe we can show a screenshot of this, you can actually see the demographic breakdown of that uploaded list. So if you have a client who's really wants to run an ABM list, and you're trying to also convince them to maybe supplement with a LinkedIn native filter, load the list, and then you can actually look at the demographics and you could see, okay, your list has these 4 main industries. You're targeting automation manufacturing and electrical manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, and construction companies. Those are the 4 industries you're targeting. And within those industries, here's the seniorities and the job functions and the company sizes that your ABM list are comprised of. Will you let me make a native LinkedIn audience filter or group with those filters? We'll target those industries, those seniorities, those job functions, those company sizes in that geography you want. It's the same like criteria that you're saying makes it a high value target. We just don't know the name of these companies, but the chances of them being actually on LinkedIn, active and able to see our ads is 10 times better than this, group that you made in a vacuum that isn't taking into account, are they the most active on LinkedIn? So those are the 2 big things, like best practices or tips that I would say could really move the needle on some of these ABM movements.
Yeah, definitely. And I really wanted to kind of go back to your first point there about targeting people outside of who you might consider the core decision makers in your, prospects company, because there's such an added value to almost enabling champions for your company internally at your clients or your prospects, businesses. Like, let's say we are trying to talk specifically to like CEOs and founders because we know that they're the main decision makers and they're the ones that are going to invest or be able to like say, yes, we want to buy into this, or no, we don't want to buy into this. But if you're trying to advocate for yourself to a CEO and you're the only one advocating for yourself, it's really like an uphill battle for your sales team almost at that point. So I love the conversation that you started here about using marketing to start to enable some of those internal champions and have them become advocates for your brand internally. So every time the CEO goes into a meeting and they meet with their, marketing team, they're like marketing lead or head of content or whatever, and they're talking about LinkedIn ads, we end up being a name that gets brought up multiple times and multiple people within the organization know who we are. Even if it's not the core decision maker, there is value in having advocates and having fans of your company almost in your prospects business.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the lower seniority level people in an organization are more apt to be active on LinkedIn. So there's also kind of this theory, it's more of a theory because I haven't really proven it. There's a theory that if you do advertise to more junior people at that company, you're more apt to maybe get a reaction from them, like a like or an engagement, which would then organically expose your company to other people in their company when they do log in. Whereas, the CEO might only log into LinkedIn once a month. And if that's the one person you're targeting, it's a lot harder to get your foot in the door there with through marketing channel.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a bit of balance to be found there too, where like, obviously we don't want to target so junior level that it
Yeah.
feels like we're almost wasting money to try and reach people that don't have that much purchasing power, but also enabling these advocates for the company. And I think that's something where like organic or those long-term content strategies can play a big role because, you don't advertising on LinkedIn is expensive, right? We don't want to waste
Yeah.
necessarily advertising dollars to reach some junior people. But if we're able to just use that first touch point, like just our cold layer to bring people to our organic content and then use that as more of a long-term nurture with some of these more junior titles. And then obviously hitting like more senior titles like CEOs or C-suite executives with some more ad retargeting strategies, then it kind of plays into that role of like finding that balance between organic and paid, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And that combination is pretty nice if you do it right.
Definitely.